Watching News at Prime. Let's bring you this discussion now. With about a week to go before a Budget Speech 2.0, the Government of National Unity is yet to reach a deal on the 60 billion rand shortfall. Trade Union Federation Cosatu is proposing a government employees pension fund holiday to avoid the VAT hike. Now, to tell us more about this proposal and how it will help avoid the much dreaded VAT increase is Cosatu's parliamentary coordinator, Matthew Parks, who talks to us from Cape Town this evening. Mr. Parks, good evening to you, and thank you very much for your time. Why do you believe that the pension holiday would go a long way to swaying the finance minister from increasing VAT?
Good evening, thanks for having us. Look, it's just one of different options that are available to government. We've raised a variety of options for government to look at. And I think our fundamental premise, number one, is that we cannot afford government to collapse. Number two is that we can't afford for government to revert to austerity budget cuts, which have really crippled the public services that workers, society, the economy depend upon. But also we want to see that when government looks for additional revenue to fund some of the good things that are in the budget that are going to rebuild the state, give relief to the poor, help unemployed find a pathway to jobs, to rebuild the economy and so forth, we think there are alternatives to a VAT hike. We can't support a VAT hike because it treats the rich the same as it treats the poor. And working class families are already struggling with the rising cost of living. Most of the goods that workers and the families buy, like electricity and transport and food, those tend to increase far above inflation. Most workers also have not received inflation-linked increases often. So I think for us, we've offered government, and we always do engage with government, to say, here are different options to consider. Some may make sense, some may not be practical, etc. But to have a debate to see how do we assist the state, because ultimately, government is the most effective, most critical tool to uplifting working class communities. So we've raised with government, number one, that we have a 64% tax compliance rate. We should be, before we add new taxes to the basket, we should be seeing how do you empower the South African Revenue Service to improve its tax collection. So we propose that give SARS at least 2 billion rand extra and require them to increase tax compliance by at least 1 to 2% a year, because that will generate 20 to 40 billion rand of existing taxes owed to the state. It doesn't make sense to add taxes to those who pay it and then to ignore that third of society who doesn't pay tax. We've also said to government, you've got on the table quite a number of economic infrastructure projects, which will really help rebuild the railway network, the ports, roads, electricity, water, etc. Things which are going to take us clearly to a 2% plus economic growth rate. We've asked, why don't we engage the developmental finance institutions, whether it's the Development Bank, Industrial Development Corporation, the Public Investment Corporation, because they already invest in economic infrastructure. They could be willing to have a discussion. We've also asked, why don't we engage these same institutions, as well as the CETAs, the National Skills Fund, to take some of the burden of the public employment programs onto their balance sheet as part of their contribution. So the state alone shouldn't carry all the burden for the socio-economic challenges we face as a society. We think there are spaces to reduce the tax loopholes for the wealthy, for some companies too, high-income companies, to really ensure that the wealthy pay their fair share of tax and we ease the burden upon workers. But around the government employee pension fund, look, for us, that would be if government is in an absolute crisis. We don't think government is in an absolute crisis. We think there's a space in a budget of 2 trillion rand to shift funds around, to find the missing 24 billion rand shortfall, etc. We don't think it'd be that complicated. But if theory says that government is in an absolute crisis, then we'd rather them go and have a discussion with the government employee pension fund board, because we as Cosatu can't make that decision. We don't have the power to do so. The GPF board has the fiduciary duty. And just discuss, there's a space for a holiday. The GPF pension fund is a defined benefit scheme. So members' pension payments remain the same, whether the pension fund investments do well or they don't do well. And they've done very well. But look, that'll really be an absolute last resort. That's not even a plan C, that's a plan Z, for example. We don't think government's in a crisis. And we doubt government's actually keen on it from our discussion with them. I think they're rightfully fearful that if you do it once, well, you need to come back the next year. And that's a solution you can only do on intervention, not even a solution. It's the intervention you could do once. You couldn't repeat it. But also there is, to be honest with you, Chloe, why we don't think it's going to happen is that there is a real trust deficit where workers, where pensioners don't trust the state. We come from a decade of state capture and corruption. Society is correctly traumatized and suspicious of the state. So we, as much as theoretically it can make sense, but we're very much doubtful that actually would happen at the end of the day. We also don't think there is an urgency that would compel government to go that route.
I'm glad you mentioned the trust deficit, because what is interesting, though, at the same time, is that you are already encouraging National Treasury to initiate discussions with the fund managers at the GEPF. Question would be, has Cosatu consulted the workers on this matter?
Yeah. So look, Cosatu has had a long-standing resolutions for many, many Congresses that pension funds, which is workers' monies, is not the private property of asset fund managers. For too long, they've been used to enrich a very lucky few asset managers who make a killing. If you look at the GPF, for example, the PIC, which is workers' monies, insurance as well, has gone from 1.8 trillion rand of assets just after COVID to about 2.3 trillion rand today, and workers have often not benefited. It's also the same with with private pension funds too. So we think there is a need, and we've raised it for many years, that pension funds should be geared towards supporting workers to ensure workers have better returns on their investments from both public and private pension funds. But also when we have an unemployment rate of 41%, when we have an infrastructure which is badly fraying, when we have an economic growth rate of 1%, we think that it's critical that our pension funds, public and private, should really be geared towards boosting the economy, towards investing in South Africa, towards boosting manufacturing, export industries, labor-intensive industries. Because when 4 out of 10 South African workers can't find work, the burden shifts to those who do have jobs to support relatives who can't find employment, and that becomes unbearable. This is precisely why workers are so heavily indebted, because they're having to support, on average, 7 relatives because of the high unemployment. So we think even beyond the 12th of March next week, the budget issue, we need a broader discussion to say, how do we use our greatest economic asset to make sure pension fund members get above inflation increases, to make sure the funds are used to create jobs, to grow the economy? We should not be investing in funds offshore all the time. We should be prioritizing investment in South Africa, whether it's in agriculture, whether it's in manufacturing, and so forth, but really in a way which actually ultimately benefits the owners of this money. It doesn't just simply benefit those who are lucky to be entrusted to invest it.
Well, let me tell you what Fedusa is saying, and it is that while it understands that South Africa is facing a tough financial or tough economic position right now, however, they are saying it is important that government cuts wasteful spending and improve efficiencies. Is that something that Cosatu is willing to place on the table?
No, we would agree with Fedusa 100%. That's why we don't think we're in such a crisis that necessitates going to the last absolute emergency plan. We are convinced you can find the 24 billion rand within a budget of 2 trillion rand. And society is correctly irritated by endless stories on the Sunday papers of this minister or that councillor or that mayor or that businessman or entrepreneur who has stolen from the state. And that's why it's very difficult, in fact impossible, to convince society of a VAT hike when they've been traumatized by years of corruption with wasteful expenditure. So there is a need for government to show humility, to say, here's where we're going to cut expenditure for public representatives. Yeah. Here's where we're going to shift expenditure to really make sure we rebuild the state, we protect the poor and the unemployed. So government has to send that message, but at the same time, we don't want to decapacitate the state. Austerity budget cuts don't work. And because as a consequence of that, Chloe, you will see queues where workers must sit for days at a time at home affairs because there's a 60% vacancy rate. When we have townships literally under siege because of high levels of crime, yet we've allowed the police force to be cut by 15% over the past decade. You've got long queues at hospitals in our townships because of a shortage of nurses, of doctors, etc. So we need to find the right balance. We just hope on Wednesday we don't go to extremes. We can't go back to austerity. We also can't go to increasing taxes upon the poor and workers. We need to rebuild the state and also to invest in the economy, to stimulate SMEs and industry, and in simultaneously give protection for the poor and unemployed. It can be done. It just requires a little bit of creativity and to really avoid extremes. And we think we're hopeful that Treasury will listen to our proposals. And we think it can be done. And so Fedusa is right to raise the issue of trust deficit. Society is scarred. So things might make sense to you and I, but society doesn't want to see a headline of VAT hike, and it correctly does not want to see a headline of a politician misbehaving as well. But not just politicians, also people in the private sector like Steinhoff. That is workers' pension funds, which were looted by private entrepreneurs, and they did not face the consequences yet in jail.
Matthew Parks, let me thank you very much for your time tonight. He is Cosatu's parliamentary coordinator.